How much of your body would you say you own? Now, if you're anything like me, the first time I heard this question, you might be sitting there thinking, shoot, I own all of my body. I teach a class on gender-based violence at Colorado State University, and I ask this question to my students every semester. And aside from some identity-based implications like, well, I'm technically 17 and need my parents' permission for a tattoo, for the most part, my students report that they own all of their bodies. This question then leads to an assignment. I ask them to spend 24 hours giving and receiving explicit verbal consent. What this means is that before they touch anyone, they have to first ask for permission. In turn, before they allow anyone to touch them, even a best friend with arms outstretched ready for a hug, they have to stop them and say, actually, would you ask for consent? Now, after many, many semesters and hundreds of students, some pretty interesting patterns have emerged from this activity. The first set of patterns are somewhat gender-related. In many ways, the women in my class come back from this activity somewhat shaken. They report out that I get touched all day long by friends, partners, bosses, teachers, strangers on the bus. The women in my class also report a pretty high rate of stress and anxiety about setting boundaries. So they say things like, I was just really worried that I was going to hurt somebody's feelings, or I didn't want to make anybody mad. The men in my class, on the other hand, come back from the activity with the realization that I touch people all day long, but mostly women. So most of the men in my class do understand and recognize that when they engage in physical contact with the men in their lives, it's usually in a combative, albeit playful manner. The other pattern that emerges from this activity has to do with which excuse students use when explaining why they have this sudden need for consent. So I give them two options, and I tell them to play with both of those options. I say, for some of the people in your life, blame it on the class. Say, I'm in this ridiculous class, and I have to ask for consent. But for other people, really own it and say things like, I've been thinking a lot about body sovereignty lately. Would you mind asking me for consent? So again, overwhelmingly, after many, many classes, the students report that the closer the relationship, the more defensive people get, particularly when they own it. So it's our friends and loved ones who say things like, what's your problem? Or I shouldn't have to ask for consent before hugging my best friend. What we find is that the very same people who should really be honoring and respecting the boundaries that we set for ourselves and the needs for body sovereignty are the same ones who really push back a lot. So my full-time job at Colorado State University is to educate students about sexual violence and consent. And after nearly a decade in this field, I can say that one of the things that's become abundantly clear is that the vast majority of my students, who by the time they're in my class really are full-grown adults, have only a vague notion of what the topic of consent even means. So let's take a second and define it. Simply stated, consent is a sober and enthusiastic yes before any activity. Now, hearing that a lot of my students have never heard this concept or don't really know fully what it means before coming to college, I think is one of the reasons why we have such high rates of sexual violence. So 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 men, and 1 in 2 trans individuals will experience sexual violence. And 98% of the time, those survivors on a college campus are harmed by someone they know and trust. So again, the very same people who should be honoring and valuing our need for body sovereignty. Now, one of the other things that I've had the opportunity to do over the course of the last 4 years is become the parent of 2 small humans. I'm not the first prevention educator who argues that we should be teaching this material sooner in middle school or high school sex ed classes. But trying to raise 2 small humans while also during the day spending time with college students talking about consent has really shown me how there's lots of ways that we very unintentionally undermine the concept of consent with our kids. I think that we need to be starting earlier, specifically this early. This is a photograph of my son, Mateo, and I borrowing Santa's chair. Now, one of the downsides of being the kid of a mom who educates about sexual violence is that you don't get to participate in too many activities that involve sitting on a strange man's lap. And I'm not saying that the answer to sexual violence is to abolish Santa, not by any means. But I do think that there are some pretty unexpected ways that we really undermine the concept of body sovereignty. My family's tried to infuse some really intentional steps to bring body sovereignty and consent into the very fabric of our family values, and I'd like to share some of those with you today. The first one is to avoid the talk. So I want you to think for a second about how old were you when someone sat you down and had the talk about sex. Now, some of you may be having painful flashbacks of angsty teenage moments. Others of you may have never really had anyone sit down and talk to you about sex. Now I want you to think, how old were you when somebody sat you down and taught you the importance of sharing or taking turns? If you're anything like me, it might actually be difficult to pinpoint one moment. So for me, I learned about kindness through many micro moments, whether it was with parents or friends or teachers or watching it on TV. I think that one of the missteps that we make when we think about consent is that we attach it to the concept of sex, which means that we're uncomfortable talking about it, we wait too long, and we often feel ill-equipped to have the conversation. So instead of the talk, I hope that my boys look back on their childhood and remember hundreds of talks that happened at various age-appropriate points in their lives. The second one is your body, your choice. I can't tell you how many times I've uttered this phrase in our house. And basically what this means is when possible and safe, we allow our kids to make the decisions that have an impact on their body. So, for example, if the walk from our house to the car is relatively short, even if it's snowing, I will honor my son's refusal if he doesn't want to wear a coat. Now, if we're going to be out at the St. Patrick's Day parade for hours, obviously a coat will be worn, but I will give him a choice, maybe about which coat to wear. Your body, your choice also means that when we're bathing our kids, we talk openly about what we're doing and try to give some agency. So I might say, Mateo, do you want to wash your penis or do you want me to? So regardless, the penis is getting washed, but he has some agency over that. Your body, your choice is not always an easy value to live by. So there's the moments when I'm feeling judged by neighbors who's watching my 4-year-old walk out to the car in a snowstorm without a coat, or the moments when he uses it against us, like in the mornings when he'll say, I don't want to go to school today. My body, my choice. Ugh. But the hardest moments, honestly, are really navigating this with other family and friends. And so your body, your choice means that our kids are never pressured or guilted into giving physical affection to anyone. So we know that survivors of childhood sexual abuse are overwhelmingly harmed by people in their lives, so family members and close friends. I work with survivors on a regular basis, and I very rarely hear stories that involve strangers in the bushes. What I end up hearing is story after story about, parents and siblings and cousins and coaches and mentors and teachers and the fathers or brothers of best friends during slumber parties. And so for us, if we are going to see a family member or friend who we want to greet with love and we want our kids to greet them with love, we give a choice. So I might say, okay, Mateo, do you want to give Auntie a hug, a high five, or knuckles? So giving that choice in the moment not only tells Mateo that he gets to choose what he wants to do with his body, but it also very clearly tells the other adults in our lives that we're teaching consent and that I'm watching. Just kidding. I'm not kidding at all, actually. The third strategy we use is body literacy. And I mean a couple things by this. So first of all, if in our household, if it's an elbow, we call it an elbow. If it's a knee, we call it a knee. If it's a vagina, we call it a vagina. So teaching age-appropriate, anatomically correct terminology to our kids, it increases confidence, it boosts body positivity, it opens parent-child dialogue. It also does deter perpetration, and in the event that abuse does happen, there's already a pathway of talking about things between parents and kids. Body literacy also means that we don't undermine what our kids say about their bodies, so we don't say things like, oh, you're not cold, or you're not full. I want my kids to be the expert on the sensations that they're having in their body, which is awesome, except for recently we were on an airplane, and as it began to descend, my son started yelling, my penis feels funny, my penis feels funny. And which I didn't even know happened, but, so he taught me that. It's true. And honestly, as much as I wanted to curl up and die in that moment, I was actually really proud that even on an airplane full of total strangers, he felt no shame about naming a sensation in his body. So body literacy also means that we are teaching how to read body cues. So if my son is wrestling with one of his best friends, Pippa, we often say gentle with bodies, but I might also point out, hey, pay attention to Pippa's face. Does it look like she's enjoying that? You can also do this when reading books, and so we might say, hey, Santino, does the Gruffalo look sad or mad on this page? Now, reading facial cues is really important. A lot of the college students that I work with will report that, yes, obviously someone who's kicking and screaming and saying no is a pretty obvious no. But what a lot of students don't know is things like, I'm not sure, maybe we should wait, let's slow down, or silence are also legally should be interpreted as no. So I want my kids to learn body cues at an early age. Body literacy can also be taught by modeling with each other. So even though my wife and I might have an understanding that I can drink out of her drink whenever I want and vice versa, we use that as moments to very loudly say, hey, mama, can I have a sip of your drink? And then we model waiting for the response, which is a really, really important part of teaching consent too, is the waiting for a reply. And then if she says no, I'm able to model that no doesn't have to be a big deal. I can keep it moving. Speaking of no, the fourth way that we infuse body sovereignty is by honoring no and making it a fun part of the game. So anyone who's around toddlers knows that a tickle game or a wrestling match can break out at any point, and they're often saying no, 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 while engaging in behavior that may be making you want to keep playing. So rather than stopping the game, we've infused no into the playing. So if they say no, we've done robot no, we've done freeze frame no, we've done slow motion no. And we always stay frozen until we get a very clear verbal, keep tickling, or more game, or robot, game on. By infusing no as a fun rather than punitive way of playing, it not only sends the message that setting boundaries doesn't need to be a big deal, but it also shouldn't have an impact on the feelings of the people that you're engaged with. And speaking of feelings, I have to say the hardest part of honoring no is when my requests for physical touch are declined. So if I've had a lousy day and I bend down and say, Mateo, can I have a hug? And he says, no thanks, and keeps walking, it's really hard to not say, but I'm really sad, or make him feel guilty or pressure him into it. But again, it's a really important part. The last piece is, don't raise kids, raise adults. So I was at a playground recently, and a little girl was building a sandcastle, and another little boy came over and knocked it over, and as I was helping her scoop up sand, her mom came over and said, oh, it's okay, boys will be boys. And even though my son wasn't the person in question who had caused harm in this moment, I felt really sad about the idea that somehow this kid's behavior was excused just because he's a boy. Now, my issue with boys will be boys is not only in that I think it undermines the expectations that we have for our young men, but the truth is boys become men. And I don't say that to shame or blame men. We know statistically that men are the perpetrators of sexual violence and physical violence at much higher rates. So if we want to be shifting the trajectory of our young men, I think it's important that we start early. So again, if I see my son wrestling with Pippa and he's not paying attention to her nonverbals, I have to really force myself to glimpse that same behavior in him as an 18-year-old on a college campus and ask myself, what am I teaching him right now about body sovereignty and about what is or is not okay about that? On the flip side, I think with our young girls, we really need to be teaching that it's okay to set boundaries and to have body sovereignty. I work with so many students who say, I didn't even know that I was allowed to say no to sex if I was in a relationship with someone. Or like the explicit verbal consent activity points out, so many young women feel guilt about setting boundaries. Our young women are taught that to please someone else is the way that we're supposed to experience pleasure. And so I think that if we want to shift that trajectory, we need to be starting early. And rather than thinking about that we are raising children, realizing that we are raising future adults. And I don't actually think that all of this is that hard. We already have the language, right? We teach kids how to share and take turns. I would be mortified if my son walked over to somebody and started drinking out of their drink, or at a restaurant walked over and started eating food off somebody's plate, right? I would intervene and teach him boundaries. So the same ways that we teach young kids boundaries around another friend's favorite toy or somebody else's food, we should be doing that about bodies. So whether the kid in your life is 2 or 8 or 18 or 28, it's never too late to start talking about body sovereignty and consent. And if the kid in your life is your child or a best friend's kid or a niece or a nephew, again, relationship doesn't have to prevent us from having these conversations. I'm not someone who will ever say that we can end rape. I think that there will always be people who will knowingly use sexual violence as a tool to harm other people. But I do think that we can drastically reduce the rates of sexual violence. And I think this is one small way. So I hope you'll join me. Thank you.